Hey guys, welcome back to Total Tactics FPL. It's Fran here, and I'm back with the Gameweek 24 cheat sheet preview. Now, of course, the biggest change between Gameweeks 23 and 24 has been that the AFCON finals have been concluded. Senegal did win, so congratulations to them. Unfortunately, it was a battle between Salah and Mane. Really, when we're talking about kind of an FPL point of view, and a lot of other Senegalese players who have been playing the Premier League, and Senegal did best Egypt in a kind of 4-2 penalty shootout. The main kind of change here, I think, is the impact on Salah and his fitness overall when we head into Game Week 24. And a lot of people who were thinking about maybe moving out of Jota, I think this could be something that we could reconsider potentially. I think it's still a good time to actually keep Jota in our teams. And maybe when we talk about Salah, he might not be a priority until really 25/26, where 26, of course, we know there's a huge announcement of a double game week with Liverpool. Over the course of the international break, we also got many more double game week 25 news. We got the Man United Brighton game, which once again calls into question whether we should actually look at more United players, right, as an example. And in 26, we do know that we have a rather substantial double game week. And I think the threat of suspensions at this point in the season is a little bit less than in earlier points. And so I think it's now a nice time to actually think about applying your chips, which I'll actually look at creating a video for. But let's actually start looking at the defenders first of all. So with the defenders, I would say that the biggest move this week is once again the recognition that Man United have a very, very good swing of games. And not only that, but just from a defensive point of view, the impact that Dalot has had playing as a consistent starter now. Because there was a short period, maybe 2 or 3 or even 4 games ago, where Dalot was having his minutes kind of rotated back with Wan-Bissaka. But it seems like he is now quite the defined starter, and you can see it even in, for example, the Middlesbrough game in the FA Cup, where he actually had a lot of significant passes as a fullback, and we know that fullbacks in the system, Rangnick should be quite dominant. So Dalot still stands as a fantastic option. Now, for those who actually still own De Gea as a keeper, I'd probably not really consider moving into the double up just to attack 25, especially since we have other game weeks to think about, such as 26 and beyond. United do have a very good run of games until 28. So as I did mention in kind of my own strategy streams, it does make sense to move out of the United defense around 28. But if you do want to go for an aggressive gamble, then maybe Dalot does make sense to kind of play around, especially for 25. Lowton unfortunately falls just because he hasn't been playing. Unfortunately, Burnley did get 2 clean sheets, which means that the actual idea to get Lowton was, I think, rather well thought out, but the simple fact that he hasn't gotten minutes just means that he has to fall on this list. Spurs defenders have also fallen. I think this is a little bit of a symptom of them having a few players being out for injury, and just the impact of them being a little bit more of a high octane kind of high scoring team that creates more chances, as opposed to a kind of very iron defense that I think we expected based on the first few kind of results of games. And not to mention that, but just the double game week of Spurs being with Man City doesn't really mean much for me. I think as someone who is looking to invest into defenders, that game is probably at best a 1.5 game week in 26, and the other games for Spurs are good but not great. And we also have some kind of issues where I think the defenders are most likely to be prone to be rotated, with exception to maybe someone like Davies, who seems like he has his position locked down in this team. You can kind of see that same issue surfacing with someone else who's falling just below in Reguilon. Reguilon had very inconsistent minutes. He's had games where he's been subbed off at halftime, games where he's only played 60 minutes. He did play the full 90 minutes in the FA Cup, which is, I think, a good kind of starting point and a basis to maybe say he could play a rather consistent minutes from here on out, but we really have to kind of hold on that. With Tanganga, I think that's a very clear and obvious example, and the same with Emerson too, where Emerson's minutes are very much threatened, so he doesn't really feature on this list anymore. Dean is someone who actually did rise because he had a great performance, and with him taking set pieces in Aston Villa, that's going to be a huge impact on Dean. And I think moving from Everton to Aston Villa just means that his chances of getting clean sheets within an equally good run of games is going to be better. We have no kind of conclusions that we can really make about Everton now beyond the kind of 4-1 victory versus Brentford in the FA Cup. But I would still say that this Aston Villa team are much more defensively well organized than Everton, and Dean is going to definitely thrive in the system. We've already seen much more chances from open play from Dean, even though he did provide an assist through a kind of corner to Emi Buendia, who was able to score a header. But Dean overall seems to be a much more interesting asset now that he is allowed to kind of play a little bit further forward, now that he's no longer with Benitez. If we go further down the list, I think Alonso is the only kind of major impact here. He did have quite a good contribution in the FA Cup once again, but I think we have seen, especially with the Spurs game, that there is a potential that he can be rotated finally, even if Tuchel is actually just simply changing his system to playing something of a back four, which is obviously something we don't really associate with Tuchel's Chelsea, primarily being a back five team. But with James coming back, maybe that will kind of incentivize Alonso to stay in this team to support a back five structure. But we'll see what happens there. Obviously, Chelsea's main impact is these kind of blank games that will be coming because of their participation in the kind of Club World Cup. So that will impact Alonso, and therefore he falls. I think as we look to move away from some of the Chelsea players, the only real asset that we should think about keeping in the future is going to be one of Mount or one of the Chelsea defenders, and that should really be James, in my opinion, as long as he actually returns to full fitness and looks good on his first game back. Robertson is actually someone who's on the rise. I did mention about the kind of influence of the AFCON and how that impacts Liverpool. A lot of people have been thinking about, let's say, moving into Robertson and going for a kind of full back four, maybe going towards 2 Liverpool players and then 2 City players. And I think obviously it makes a lot of sense to go for 3 Liverpool players by game week 26 so you can attack the double game week properly. And it seems like a lot of people's ideas are to actually move away from Jota and to actually go into Robertson. This does actually seem to make sense to me because Robertson is interesting because he's actually a little bit cheaper than Jota. So you would actually get a little bit of a cost benefit kind of for your team and your kind of team structure. And people think that with Firmino coming back and being able to play in games, and with Luis Diaz also occupying spaces on the left, which I actually don't think really conflates much with Jota's position. I think Jota primarily plays as a centre forward. And one thing that is key with Jota, and maybe keeping Jota as an argument, is that Firmino simply hasn't been fantastic for the last 2 years. I would say his form has considerably dropped off. It's not just the fact that he provides playmaking for the team when he drops deep. Jota doesn't do as much, but it's, I think, the efficiency that Jota brings within the attack, his kind of positioning and finding space as the open man when players like Salah and Mane are occupied, has actually been quite beneficial for the team as of late. So I really think that Jota will actually keep his space in the team, but I would also argue that Robertson has been fantastic too, especially in the kind of back half of the season that we've actually gone through, where he was rather dry in terms of his kind of runs forward in the earlier parts of the season, probably due to his actual injuries. But now that we've actually seen Robertson have a steady run of games and kind of pick up fitness, we've actually seen a lot of assists, and his numbers aren't necessarily comparable to Trent, but they still make him extremely worthwhile because we know that Trent is arguably an undervalued asset. All right, so let's now move on to the midfielders. So with the midfield, I would say there has been quite a lot of movement, but mostly just due to the actual fixtures, nothing to do with the form of players necessarily. If you can see here, a lot of Arsenal players are now kind of facing a fall. That's just due to the fact that they have blanks 2 weeks in the future, and it's really hard to kind of keep an Arsenal player in your team at this point in time unless you're thinking about maybe going for a gamble where you, let's say, play the Arsenal players on 26 when they have a double game week, and then you free hit 27 to kind of get rid of the blank, because a lot of us will have 3 Liverpool players with game week 27. So if you don't have a full playing team and you have some Arsenal players, for example, such as Ramsdale and maybe an additional defender, an additional midfielder, you would kind of be hard pressed to kind of play the free hit chip in that kind of blank game week. Maybe you would actually prefer into that week with maybe something like 10 players, and that would actually be fine for you. But it's really up to you how you want to play that. Although I do think that is quite a kind of aggressive tactic that kind of predicates on you doing extremely well in 26. One thing that I will say about Arsenal is that they have somewhat dropped in terms of their kind of goal creating opportunities. Tierney still seems like a very interesting option overall, just because as a defender, you don't see someone who actually bombards that far high up the field often. But when it comes to the midfielders, I think that is definitely a significant impact, where players like Odegaard, Martinelli, and Smith Rowe have not been combining for too many chances. So that of course is going to be a huge impact when we think about going for Arsenal players, even for the double game week in 26. Another thing too to mention with Arsenal, I think, is that Ramsdale has a perfect swing with the kind of game week 28, where De Gea seems to kind of trail off with some kind of bad games, especially facing Man City in 28. So if you're ever thinking about going for Arsenal players, maybe the priority would still be to go for a defender or a goalkeeper as opposed to a midfielder at this point in time. If we go further down the list, Buendia is someone who is new on the list. I think he just simply benefits from Aston Villa's very, very good run of green games. And yes, whilst Aston Villa don't actually have double game weeks, it's still worth pointing out that over the course of history, we've always seen players with very, very good individual single game weeks do extremely well. And during this run where we were kind of promoting Dean as an asset, I think Buendia and Coutinho still are very, very good options and interesting options to have at this point in time. Maddison is someone who unfortunately falls, I think, due to the kind of scheduling conflicts that Leicester will face. It doesn't seem like he will actually have double game weeks in the near future, and especially with the games being rather tough, it does make sense to move Maddison on to another asset, such as another premium like a Bruno who has a double game week, or other assets that you might be thinking about who would be a little bit cheaper so that you can actually accommodate for maybe a double premium structure, because it seems like a lot of us will be moving into something like a Fernandes kind of Salah midfield very, very shortly. Saka is someone who falls for the same reason as above, as kind of outlined with the Arsenal team. Kulusevski is a new option. I think he's one of those midfielders who's been added to the game, who's at a fantastic price. Now, Eriksen too is another midfielder who's been added to the game, but I would say that Brentford are in a weird position because they've actually played a lot of games compared to some of the other teams in the league. You'll notice that, of course, Brentford had played 2 back-to-back doubles just before we kind of headed off for the international break. So that's going to be quite a big impact when it comes to, picking players. Someone like Kulusevski, who hasn't necessarily featured yet for Spurs, but should be quite a big option, I think, going forwards, either playing as a right winger at times or even a right wing back, can be a huge kind of option at 5.4 to supplement the fact that Spurs have had a lot of games remaining to play. Even if, let's say, you consider the double game week that should be scheduled with City and should go ahead in 26, Kulusevski still has a lot of ample opportunities to play games, and he's sort of in the same position as well as Cornet, who's actually right below him. Cornet is someone who we know was electric before he went to AFCON, before he suffered a kind of injury at the Newcastle game, especially with Burnley having a lot of games to go. Right now, they've actually established a very, very solid defense, which is classically what we've known Burnley for. But I'm sure in the games to come, him and Weghorst could strike up a very decent combination where hopefully Weghorst is someone who plays as a target man, and Cornet is going to be that kind of deep lying forward who plays a little bit more freely within this Burnley attacking system and could benefit in the games to come. The one issue with Cornet and Kulusevski, of course, is that you have a lot of midfielders now who are priority, especially with the double game weeks, and it might be hard to actually pick them in your team. I think that they're very good replacements for something like a Gray in your team. But Gray still seems like an interesting option for me, especially with Dominic Calvert-Lewin out and Everton actually looking quite good versus Brentford in the FA Cup. If we move further down the list, Mount simply has an impact where, due to the blanks, as I mentioned, with the Club World Cup, Chelsea assets aren't necessarily going to fall down this list. They will actually rise quickly up in priority, because if you look at their games post 27, which is their last blank, Chelsea have a wonderful kind of streak of games, and that does make a lot of sense to kind of put Mount back in your team. He might even be a good replacement for one of your double premiums in the near future. Someone like a Bruno who could be downgraded into Mount seems to make a lot of sense to me, given the kind of fixture kind of swap up between Chelsea and United. Gundogan is someone who falls. I just think that unfortunately Gundogan has just not participated enough in the season to be worthwhile. He was electric last year, but that doesn't really kind of pay any rewards for this season. And we've even seen him coaching as well for City, which obviously reflects his kind of wider ambitions, but he is kind of slowly moving towards a stage in his career where he's not going to play consistent minutes. He might be called upon in Champions League games, but as a consistent FPL starter, I really think that he should be one of the first options that you look to kind of get out of your team if he still is. The same kind of thing happens with Sterling. I wouldn't say Sterling is near the end I wouldn't say he's near the end of his career at all. But the main thing with Sterling is going to be the impact of minutes, especially with Mahrez coming back into the team. That's much more minutes contested. And at that kind of price point, I just don't think Sterling's worth it. Whereas if you look at KDB, who's a little bit more expensive, the reason why I think he's worth it is because he's nailed. But that's certainly not the case for Sterling, who seems like he could still be out of Man City by the end of the season. So we'll see what happens there. Bruno is definitely a massive rise. There's no real contest there. He has great games until 28 and also 25, where he becomes a kind of primary captain option at 25. If we head to the forwards, King and Dennis are people who fall. I think the one thing that I would mention is that Watford did seem like a more defensive team, especially with Ranieri going out of the team, and that's going to simply affect King and Dennis, even though they have a double game week at 26. I think it still remains to be seen what happens when Sarr is integrated back into the team, because we have a new manager and we kind of need to assess what is going on with King and Dennis. I think that it would be quite wise to actually, if you were doubling up on King and Dennis, to actually move out of them again. Maybe look at an option like Edouard, who is on the rise just below. Edouard is a kind of second striker in this Crystal Palace system, as Mateta is the kind of larger target man type feature in the system. But I think the nice thing about Edouard is first of all, he does take penalties, and he has been highly contributory towards their open play. He still leads actually Crystal Palace on a kind of per 90 minutes basis as well, within goals and expected assists. So Edouard's, for me, is still a prime option over a Mateta, over an Olise. Gallagher, of course, is a great option if you're looking at a midfielder, but I think Edouard is probably the kind of forward you'd like to pick, especially since we're heading into a kind of situation where it probably makes a lot more sense for us to actually funnel our money towards the midfielders, as Bruno has a very good double game week, Salah has a good double game week right after that, and that is an interesting time, I would say, to pivot into a cheaper kind of strike force, and Edouard represents that as well. Tony is someone who has been in exceptional form as of late, but I would say if you were kind of following the kind of developments since the international break, there of course was a kind of mild controversy with him kind of talking about Brentford in a rather disreputable manner. We'll see what happens there, but hopefully he still remains to be a good option going forwards. I wouldn't say Brentford have the easiest of games, but they have shown to be definitely on a kind of uptrend in terms of both goal scoring and creation, and also just Tony's ability to be a talismanic player. Richarlison is someone who is new on this list, especially fresh off of DCL's injury. It's an unfortunate situation for DCL, but I've always found that Richarlison has kind of stepped up in his absence, and I think that therefore he remains to be a very, very strong differential at this point in time. Lacazette is a clear fall, and that just goes in tandem with both Arsenal's kind of fixture structure and also his lack of impact in recent games. I would say he plays a very supportive role for the team, but not necessarily supportive in the sense that he gets assists and things like that, but just more positionally. He does like to kind of fill in the spaces and the gaps, like a Karim Benzema, but unlike the kind of modern day Karim Benzema, he is not the sort of same prolific goal scoring presence. If we go further towards the kind of premiums, I would say Kane and Ronaldo are actually people who kind of rise, and that's just due to the impacts of, first of all, if you're not going for someone like Bruno, or you don't really have space for Bruno in your team, or it's much easier to side grade from Kane to Ronaldo, or even to move away from Lukaku as an example, or even Vardy, I would say Ronaldo still has fantastic games until 28. Yes, he's been on a dry run in the Premier League, but I still think that he will very easily be able to score within the next few games, and we sort of saw that with the Middlesbrough game. I thought that was a perfect example to show that both Fernandes and Ronaldo are the talismans of this team, even though Sancho was the one who actually ended up scoring that game. The main impact, of course, is going to be the fact that Ronaldo took more than 10 plus shots in that game, still is the penalty taker for United, so we'll definitely benefit with that over the kind of fixtures to come. Kane still seems to be someone who is in exceptional form. We saw that in the Brighton game in the FA Cup, and he's definitely been a little bit unfortunate at certain times this season with some of the disallowed goals too. So I would say that Kane's form is definitely very, very hot, and I think he is still worth being a player that you actually keep in your team if you don't have an easy way to kind of go into Fernandes and Salah very shortly. Lukaku is the fall for, I think, obvious reasons. I just think that this Chelsea team still haven't found a structure to really accommodate for him yet, and whether it's more of a question of him to for him and the onus for him to kind of accommodate to this Champions League winning side is not really up for debate. I think Lukaku is simply as someone who we can't really consider as an FPL asset consistently, especially with the fixtures to go ahead with Chelsea, and that's pretty much what it comes down to. To round things off with the goalkeepers, Lloris is the one who falls for the same reasons why I kind of articulated that Spurs don't seem to be as threatening a defensive side. It seems like they're much more interested in kind of creating open play chances and actually taking on those chances to kind of capitalize on the players that they have at their disposal with Son and with Kane. Pope is someone who also is a new option. He's going to have doubles in the future no matter what. He's, of course, at a kind of interesting price where he's kind of suffered from his success in previous seasons, where until last week where he had a double game week and got 2 clean sheets, Pope was not a very sensible option to go for. And especially now that Lowton doesn't seem like a cheap kind of access Burnley defender option who might be interesting, Pope is going to be one who you might want to look at in the future if you actually expect Burnley to actually pick up clean sheets versus some of what I would say are some easier games that are due to be rescheduled. And that's pretty much it for this cheat sheet. I hope you guys have a wonderful week, and I'll see you guys very shortly for the team selection.